Started too early. You started when they were doing the 3, 2, 1.
Oh, I thought. So it's their 3-2-1, not your 3-2-1.
So I go 10, 9, 8, and then there's a 3, 2, 1 after I go 3, 2, 1.
See,
Like right now,
I thought you
everybody's
were in
starting
charge. I thought you had some ownness on this situation.
I should like be working on the Instagram right now.
Okay, but why don't you work on the Instagram and I'll sip my coffee?
There we go. Oh wait, he's sipping the coffee.
Gary's sipping his Bustelo made by Smuckers.
Don't,
No.
don't worry, we're live on Instagram now.
Okay, no, this is Cafe Bustelo. Okay.
Yeah,
We'll work on that later.
and if you read the fine print, it says made by JB Smuckers. I was just so distraught when I found out it wasn't really Cuban coffee.
Bustelo's sold out and sold to the
Okay.
gringos.
Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, it is Sunday. And it's not just any Sunday, it's the Sunday after primaries. We now know what our goals are, what our things we have to do are, because we have so much more clarity than we had a week ago, right? Well, we'll find out. Let's get into the rotation. We got what our goals are, what our things we have to do are, because we have so much more clarity than we had a week ago, right? Well, we'll find out. What in the world is happening? What our goals are, what are things we have to do.
We're just, the Telegram screwed up. I'm sorry.
All right.
I'm having issues streaming over Telegram. That's an issue. Andrew, I'm sorry for the informalities
no apologies
of
needed.
this morning, but we're good. I'm not going to make any more mistakes.
Okay. We are semi-professionals here. Don't try this at home. We know what we're doing. At least it looks that way. It is Sunday. It is a rotation, and we have a lot to get to. So let's get to it. How about cueing that great music? In my soul, you're a corner in my heart. I'm going to get rid of my blurred background because it's not blurring anything. They're lying to me. Okay, how about that? Is that better?
Yeah, you look good, Gary. Sound good.
I am still exhausted just from watching the damn convention this last week. Not as much exhausted as I was from when I was watching the Republican convention. But it's amazing. We got two people here who were at the convention last week. I've actually been to two conventions in my life, and neither of them were actually DNCs, just so you know. The first one was in Detroit in 1980, which was a Republican National Convention where our mayor said that Ronald Reagan was a prune face, and that's how we welcomed him to the city. And the last one was right here in Tampa in 2012, where we had the RNC in the hottest part of the year, where everybody was walking out of the convention center with huge pit stains, which I thought was really, really, impressive for all the Republicans who were there. I was able to sneak in because of some people that I knew, and it was a very interesting time.
Why the pit stains?
Because it was humid as hell having to walk from the convention center over to.
Now he's freezing. That's why I didn't.
MSNBC all setting up. Everybody was walking over there to get a chance to talk to folks. But this was an amazing amount of energy and actual truth, I think, that was coming out of this convention. And I just want to get, first off, Chris, you were there. And our guest today, Andy, is going to be talking to us about that too. We can get into that. Let me go ahead and introduce people because I'm just out of it right now until I get my coffee without sipping. All right. My name is Gary Stein. I'm your political director from Suncoast Normal. A graduate of Johns Hopkins. And that means that we need to have Wes Moore on the show. Wes, if you're listening, your state is my alma mater. Get your ass on our show. I mean, in a nice way, of course. And to my down below, to my left, we have Carlos Ermida, our deputy director and master of business administration.
Thank you.
And right above us, our master of public administration and our executive director, Christopher Cano, who is in the Beltway.
There, you want to introduce yourself, Cano?
All right. And our special guest today is, in my heart, the person who should have been the state attorney for the last decade and still today, but isn't. And we'll get into that why and why he will probably be there back again there very soon. Andrew Warren. Andrew, good to see you again today.
And likewise, Gary, thanks for having me.
So you were actually just driving by Chicago at the time, possibly in Gary, Indiana, and said, "I think I'll go over to the arena over in Chicago and jump into the convention." Is that how it worked out? Because we saw you there.
Yes, it was something like that. So, we had the primary here on Tuesday, and I want to thank all the voters and supporters who, pushed me through the primary to get to November, which is where our focus has been. And then I had the opportunity to go up to Chicago for a couple of days as a delegate to the DNC, and it was my first convention. It was extremely interesting, and as you said, energetic, and people are, are enthused about President Kamala Harris to be on the ticket and to, take over from President Biden next year.
It's an exciting time, like I honestly, like I was watching those speeches and I was reminded of like when Obama was campaigning and like we had hope. I was so distraught after the first debate and, I saw Biden, being old, I guess is what I'm hearing. And I was like, well, shit, like now, everybody should vote for this guy, but like now nobody's going to vote for this guy. And everything's going to get screwed up. And we can't handle another 4 years of Donald Trump. My small business can't handle another 4 years of Donald Trump. And then, now we have Kamala. And what was it like, guys, to be in that arena and to feel that the joy and the hope and all this stuff going on?
Yeah, well, there was a ton of juice in the room. There was a ton of energy. But I think the biggest thing about it was just the uplifting message, right? It was a message, Carlos, as you said, of hope. It was a message of patriotism and looking forward to progress and just helping people, not like the vengeful negativity we're hearing from Trump, but this positive enthusiasm. How can we make people's lives better? How can we help more people achieve the American dream? And again, there were just a lot of positivity, a lot of enthusiasm.
One of the things that was a concern to me, looking at the vote tally this last primary, it was extremely, extremely low. I mean, in the state of Florida, I think, but we may have gotten 76,000 votes out of 22 million people, something along those lines. I just can't believe how few people went out and vote, but I saw a lot of despair and just apathy that has grown out of the what has happened over the last few months. And that's a shame because we are representative government. If you don't go to vote, you're not going to be represented the way you want to be represented. That's the bottom line. And we end up getting people who take folks out of office for no reason. And I'd like to get into that fairly quickly. When I saw you last year talking about the story about Robert Dubois. Yeah, Dubois. And if you could get into that, because this is something that you don't see every day that state attorneys get a chance to do. And after a crowning achievement, something crazy happened right at the end of it. You want to get into that for just a moment?
Yeah, of course. So when I was elected in 2016, I had talked about the need to have a wrongful conviction unit inside the state attorney's office. And just for background, for people who don't know, the state attorney is like the district attorney. So it's the countywide prosecutor. And, I ran on a platform of how do we make our community safe and how do we make our system better, more effective. And one of the things that we talked about doing was establishing a wrongful conviction unit, which most major cities have. And so we ended up starting one in about 2018 in the office. And we ended up with a case. And long story short, there was a man who had been wrongfully convicted of a rape and murder from 1983. And this came to our attention in 2019, so 36 years later. And we spent about a year investigating that case with the Innocence Project, and were able to conclusively determine through DNA evidence that he was not guilty. He hadn't committed the crime. He wasn't there. He had nothing to do with it. And he was very quickly released from prison after a judge saw the evidence. The Florida legislature ended up recognizing by a nearly unanimous vote his innocence. But when you convict the wrong guy, it means that the right people, the actual perpetrators, got away with the crime. So after we determined that he was not the criminal, he was not the man who had committed this heinous crime, we started investigating, and we worked with state and local law enforcement for about 2 years to put together a case, which is now a 38, 39-year-old cold case into who actually raped and murdered this young woman. And while we were doing that, we determined that the 2 suspects in that case had actually raped and murdered another young woman in an unsolved crime from right around the same time period back in 1983. So again, fast forward 2 years. So we take a year to investigate and exonerate the man who is wrongfully convicted. We take 2 years to build cases that we can actually charge and prosecute against these 2 men for 2 separate cold case rapes and murders. And on August 4th of 2022, I was sitting in the grand jury supervising the indictment so that those 2 men could finally be charged after nearly 4 decades. And this happens so rarely in American history. You know, there have been a lot of people who've been exonerated, and a lot of people have been exonerated after a murder, but very few people, like you can count them on one hand, where cases where someone's exonerated for murder and then prosecutors are actually able to charge the actual perpetrators. So that's what happened. That's what I was doing on August 4th, 2022. When ironically, I was suspended by the governor, supposedly for not doing my job. So that's the irony of the whole story, is I was doing what, you know, the epitome of what it means to be a prosecutor, exonerating the innocent, fighting for justice for the victims, not taking no for an answer, aggressively prosecuting the actual perpetrators of these heinous crimes. And that's when the governor pulled his political stunt. It was on that day.
Yeah, you're actually, like, I was doing quite a, you know, I heard about the whole thing that happened to you a while back, but finding out that you were going to be on the show, I did a little bit of research on you, and you're actually pretty tough on crime. Like you don't let things really slip through the cracks, right? Like you've taken that stance, so you're going to make sure that if there's a criminal, you're going to prosecute, right? On the other hand, I saw, you know, excuse me for bringing up the name, but I saw an interview with Chad Cronister, and they don't seem to be very happy with you on, which might be actually be a good thing. But he had like a list, you know, like, you know, the whole thing that went down with you happened for abortion, but he had like a list of crimes that you weren't tough on. Marijuana was actually part of that list, and I was like, I freaking love this Andrew Warren guy.
I mean, look, our vision is about maximizing public safety, as I said, and making the system more fair and effective and fighting for victims. And how do you do that? And the reality is that we have far too many cases that come into the office to prioritize everything, right? The person who says my priorities are everything actually has no priorities. So for me, from day one, our priority was on prosecuting and aggressively prosecuting crimes that threaten public safety. So, you know, all the crimes that we think about, rape and murder and robbery and, you know, crimes against kids and domestic violence and people selling drugs, right? These are all the things that we think of as the crimes that erode safety in our community. But keep in mind, there are so many people who get into the system for things like driving on a suspended license, for crimes that result from mental illness and substance addiction. And we have to, at the same time as aggressively prosecuting crimes, we want to make sure we're investing in safety through prevention and rehabilitation. And so you mentioned the sheriff, for example. You know, the sheriff and I stood shoulder to shoulder and implemented all these policies, from civil citations and mental health court and aggressively prosecuting crimes. And this was all political in terms of the governor's stunt and the people who supported this stunt. But when you look at the basic facts of what we did, we took the right approach, the approach that the community supported me in, and an approach that reduced crime by 32% during my first 5 years in office. I mean, we made Hillsborough the safest large county in Florida. And to be clear, when I say we, I mean the partnership between the state attorney's office, law enforcement, and community organizations. That's how we had such tremendous success.
Why it went directly to my face, I don't know. This camera.
Okay. Well, here's a question
I
need.
Go ahead, Carlos. I want to jump in here, actually. This is actually really cool to hear you say that, because there was a current event that happened, and part of that interview with Chad Cronister, that I'm talking about, he had Grady Judd standing behind him. And Grady Judd actually was recently in the news. There was this cannabis thing. Have you heard of that?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so there's the green cannabis. There was these guys in Lakeland that, you know, the I think it's husband wife couple that had like basically like this store, but like in a bus, and they're traveling around Polk County, fucking selling hemp and other stuff, but they were found to be selling marijuana. So Grady Judd, you know, did a whole thing where he like went up in front, did a press conference, and he's like, I'm tough on marijuana. I hate drug addicts. I hate people selling drugs. If you're in my county, you know, and being a politician like he is. And this has bothered me. This is why I cut off Gary, because that, you know, like as an activist for marijuana legalization, you can take two stances on that. Either the people that drive the cannabis and sell the weed out of the cannabis, they're not helping anybody to legalize marijuana. They're giving us a bad name. They're making us look bad. And then on the other hand, and this is really the opinion that I kind of share, it's like, why the fuck does Grady Judd care so much about a husband and wife traveling around selling marijuana when it's not that big of a freaking deal? He's probably got a lot of other things to worry about, like, you know, strong drug use and murders and rape and things like that. Why does he seem to like want to prioritize these different things? And I think of like the Oakland Police Department. The Oakland Police Department came out one time saying, hey, you know, like, yeah, marijuana is illegal, but we've got freaking gangs over here. You know what I mean? Like, we've got a lot of other things that we need to worry. We need to protect and serve the people. And going after these marijuana arrests are not suitable, right? Do you think that, you know, Florida sheriffs should kind of be like, hey, like, there's other things to worry about other than marijuana? Do you think that'd be a more responsible approach for law enforcement? Or do you think do you think people like the cannabis people should stop and, you know, stop giving us a bad name?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, it's a complicated question. So,
yeah,
I mean,
those.
right. The reality is that sheriffs are elected, and they're elected to do what their constituents and their neighbors and the people in their community want them to do. And if the people of Polk County want Grady Judd to focus on marijuana to the, you know, exclusion of more violent crime, then that's their choice. And, you know, he's enforcing the law, and that's fine. The question is, what are the trade-offs, right? And so, you know, Sheriff Judd has talked about, you know, he's criticized me and my suspension, but our crime rate here is way lower than it is in Polk County. So maybe he could learn a thing or two from actually looking at that policies that work and how you deploy resources in the most effective way to reduce crime. But again, I mean, what Sheriff Judd does in his jurisdiction is up to him. And if the voters don't like it, they'll let him know at the ballot box. But you also touch on another important point, Carlos, which is really the intersection between violent crime and the sale of marijuana. And, you know, I think we'll get to this when we talk about Amendment 3, but just keep in mind that there is a lot of violence associated with the black market sale of illegal drugs. Mm-hmm. And we looked at numbers in Hillsborough County over a period of a few years when I was in the office. And, you know, we saw like some 25, 30% of shootings over the span of a couple of years were marijuana related, like marijuana ripoffs. During that time, you know how many shootings we had over the sale of tobacco? 0. Mm. How many shootings we had over the sale of alcohol? 0. And so you have to look at the fact that whether or not you support legalization of marijuana or don't support it, whether you think it's a very harmful vice or it's a vice that's, you know, on par with tobacco and alcohol, there are implications for the criminalization of marijuana that go far beyond just the possession and sale of it, because there is that violent crime that gets associated anytime you have people doing illegal activity. You can just ask Al Capone, go back to the 1920s and Prohibition.
I can't ask him. Mike, he's dead by now. But
yeah,
you can look it up on Wikipedia. Then, fair point.
I'm done, guys. Go right ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I think you know, Andrew brings up a great point in that, you know, regulated markets are safer.
Yeah.
You know, with a regulated market, there aren't kids getting access to it, because the truth is that criminals don't care. They're not going to ID you before they sell to you, you know. But no one can walk into Carlos's shop. It's even on the door, you know. It's 21 and up, you know. Same with any licensed dispensary. So again, what we've seen is teen use go down in regulated states. You know, I know we got to save the kids crowd is always a vocal opponent of legalization, even though all the data points to the opposite of their opinion and their stance on things. Is that, you know, families are safer, neighborhoods are safer when you live in a legal state. More than that, the increased tax revenues that they get, you know, from the legal market oftentimes allows investment into public schools. I mean, look what they did in Minnesota. You know, Governor Tim Walz made sure that every single kid has school lunches. And you can look there's a direct correlation between revenues that are generated from the legal market and what they can use to plug budget shortfalls. You know, my concern in Florida, again, is the political will of the people in power, because, you know, we should have had a more robust medical system, but the people in power made it vertically integrated and limited. We should have already had the ability to grow at home medically, but the people in power chose to fight Joe Redner in his lawsuits, you know, all the way up to the Florida Supreme Court. The people in power, aka Ron DeSantis, chose to remove a sitting state attorney who's sitting right next to you now, Carlos, that his predecessor was the third worst prohibitionist in the country and prosecuted more people for marijuana than all the violent crimes put together in his 16-year tenure. And you have a guy who within 5 years had reduced crime, cleaned up the department, and prioritized where we should be spending our law enforcement dollars. And you know, and because Andrew had a strong political stance and saying, you know what, I'm not going to put women in jail for having, you know, agency over their own reproductive decisions. That was it. That was the statement. It wasn't a violation of any laws. It was just a simple statement of, you know, I don't think I'm going to do that if that comes down the pipeline. And he removed them. You know, and we saw the same thing with Ron DeSantis removing, you know, and cracking down on other state attorneys in the Orlando area. And there is a distinct pattern of one, you know, I see him cracking down on people who don't share his political opinion. And two, other than Andrew, he tends to not like black women in power in the state attorney's office, because you know, it's this consistent pattern of removing black women who makes decisions he doesn't like. So, you know, I'm not calling him a racist. I'm just saying that some of that data doesn't point well to him. And more, but I'll say this much, Andrew, we supported you wholeheartedly in 2016 for your election, and we're going to wholeheartedly support you now in 2024 and putting you back in that office where you belong. And we appreciate all the hard work that you've done for this community to get us to the point where we're at. It's a shame that politics has pushed things to this point where you know, you get dismissed and then we have to reelect you. I think that we're doing the same thing with your counterparts over in Orange County, having to put Monique Worrell back in the office. So it's kind of crazy that we elect people and then the governor decides to fire them, and then we have to fight to put them back in the office just because they're good prosecutors.
You know, I have an app, by the way, that anytime that the price of foam core goes down, I get a notification, because that means that somewhere Grady Judd is buying up all of it that he could possibly find for some of his press conferences. And he always does very interesting press conferences with very interesting graphics. And usually there's this big spread of all the drugs that were picked up from a particular raid and all the guns that were involved. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a illegal market versus a regulated market. And it's because of the fact that it's illegal, I think it has a lot to do with how many firearms are involved. Like, for instance, how many smoke shops do you know are well armed, Carlos? You know any of them that have huge gun collections in the back room?
No.
Other than don't try chillin', because I'm sure Carlos has a hand cannon behind the counter.
No, well, you know,
It's also a vicious dog.
We have security measures here, but I don't have anything that would hurt anyone. But we have things like panic buttons and stuff like that. But there's actually a smoke shop in St. Pete that keeps bear mace behind the counter, being pretty popular for that.
But this is a question I wanted to ask Andrew Warren. take the product and make it legal so that people can use a regulated market where people are safe with a product that they buy and they know they're not buying it illegally, will the amount of crime go away? Will the amount of gun use go away?
So it's a great question, Gary. And I think the short answer is presumably yes, based on what the evidence suggests. And there's no way to predict the future with 1,000% accuracy. But again, when you look at what's happened in other states, and I think we're up to 24 states in the District of Columbia now have recreational marijuana legalized, you have tended to see violent crime rates drop in those areas for the reasons that I articulated just a few minutes ago. And as you guys said, right, the illegal trafficking of anything usually involves crime and people with guns and turf battles and gang activity, right? So there's this road towards violence in the unregulated, illegal black market. Whereas when you have a regulated market, I mean, again, you don't see people shooting up a CVS trying to buy a 6-pack of Busch Light. And so what do we do going forward? You have to recognize that implementing a law like this is not just a one and done. It requires responsible framework moving forward. How are we regulating this? How are we limiting the sale to, to kids, for example? How are we making sure that there is not going to be this gray market where you continue to have an illegal trade that may be associated with violent crime? How do you make sure that the product you're selling is safe for people? Are you limiting the potency of it? So, and again, I'm kind of jumping towards the Amendment 3 issue, but regardless of whether it's constitutional amendment or it's a law that's passed, you want to make sure that you have this robust framework when you're moving from something that is illegal to something that is legal, to make sure that it's done in an effective, smart way that protects the community, protects the rights of individuals to use the product while limiting the people who shouldn't be using it, like kids. And that's not something that happens overnight. And hopefully, if Florida passes Amendment 3, you have the people in Tallahassee embrace it and construct that helpful framework rather than just getting frustrated and saying, well, we're not going to do anything. And, a pox upon everyone's house who voted for this.
Now, the law enforcement basically has a limited budget when it comes down to it. From the state attorney's office straight down to the street cop, there's just so much money they can spend, and so they have to prioritize what they do. And you are what we call the second line of defense, essentially. When a policeman uses their discretion whether or not to arrest somebody for possession, the next step, of course, it goes to the courthouse, and you decide as state attorney whether it's nolle pros or you continue on with this violent crime of actually having a pre-roll in your pocket you haven't used yet.
Yeah.
And
so there are a couple of things in there. One is, like I said from the beginning of my race in 2016, I'm far more concerned about the person with a gun hidden in their pocket than I am with a joint hidden in their pocket, because one is a clear threat to public safety and the other is not. But keep in mind that what you said is generally correct. But in Hillsborough County, it's actually a little bit different because we enacted civil citation programs during my time in office with support from law enforcement. And it's important just to pause on that, because you'll hear some of the governor's, cronies be like, oh, Andrew wasn't enforcing that. First of all, that's totally not true. But even the crimes that I had deprioritized, such as, misdemeanor possession of marijuana, we did with law enforcement support. We passed a civil citation program with law enforcement support. Oh, yeah. So that first-time offenders who have under 20 grams, which is the misdemeanor amount in the state of Florida, aren't actually arrested. They're given a civil citation. So we found that alternative path than having an arrest and putting them in the formal criminal justice system. So I just want to make sure people understand it's not as simple as police see someone with a joint, they arrest them, it comes to me, I decide whether to prosecute or not. We saw a huge decrease in arrests because law enforcement and the state attorney and the public defender and all these, partnerships worked on the civil citation program to have a civil citation available for misdemeanor possession of marijuana for first-time offenders, kids and adults.
Okay, so say Amendment 3 passes, a long shot in my opinion, but if our legislator treats it right and puts in a good system, but say all that happens and by next July we have a Jesus Christ. we have a great system in place, right? And you, of course, when you're in your rightful place as state attorney, right? How do you have any idea how much of your time would be taken away from marijuana and put into more violent crimes? Do you know how much of the state's resources would go? Do you know anything about that at all?
I do. I don't know the exact numbers offhand, but we kept that data in the office. Um, you know, people think that marijuana was this huge crime. It really wasn't. I mean, again, you have sale of marijuana and you have trafficking of marijuana, and then the most common crime is you have possession. And it's usually possession under that threshold amount, which makes it a misdemeanor. But it's tiny in comparison to, for example, driving on a suspended license, which I mentioned before, a far more common crime in Hillsborough in the state of Florida. That all being said, when you're not arresting people for marijuana possession, when we're not prosecuting them, it does free up resources to use for crimes that pose a greater threat to the community. And let's focus on the misdemeanor possession, because the trafficking that we're seeing is a threat to public safety for reasons that I talked about before. And that's something that likely disappears with the legalization of marijuana. But you're absolutely right that this is a matter of resources and where we prioritize resources. It's also worth noting, and I'm going down a little bit of a different, avenue here, but it became much more difficult for the state to actually prosecute marijuana cases and make arrests for marijuana after medicinal marijuana was passed, because someone who is pulled over for a traffic stop and there's the smell of marijuana, there's a reasonable belief that that person may have a prescription for marijuana and may have it legally. And law enforcement's not, prohibited from asking questions about it, but it becomes a sort of a gray area. It used to be that basically the smell of marijuana alone gave you probable cause to stop and search and potentially make an arrest. That's no longer the case. And so the Florida Department of Law Enforcement a couple of years ago talked with state attorneys' offices and law enforcement saying, how do we do this now that we have medicinal marijuana? How does that affect law enforcement's reaction and response on the street? And how does that complicate cases that are being prosecuted? So again, this is a complicated area that's been complicated by the changes in the law that we saw a couple of years ago with medicinal marijuana that will continue to have to evolve if Amendment 3 passes, so that we figure out how do you distinguish between the person who has a personal amount of marijuana for personal use and the guy who's got, a kilo of marijuana and cocaine and fentanyl with some guns in the back of his trunk. Obviously, we want to be able to arrest and prosecute the person in the latter situation without violating the constitutional rights of the person in the former situation.
Well, I want to, Gary, there's a couple things that, Andrew just touched on, and I want us to also, touch on it. Carlos, you mentioned about the Florida legislature getting it right post Amendment 3 implementation. One of the things that has worked up here in the DMV, Maryland, DC, Virginia, is that they got rid of smell as probable cause. It's explicit in the statutes that the smell of cannabis alone is not probable cause. And so, Andrew talked about how it's a kind of a guidance from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, but legislators up here went a step further and made it explicit. And I think that, that is valuable in the sense that so many police interactions, especially for people of color, oftentimes start with establishing some type of probable cause for a stop that didn't need to happen in the first place. And so, this is a good step in reducing the number of interactions that can happen if we eliminate that for probable cause. But Andrew, I have a clear question that I hope you can address as the once and future state attorney, in that if we pass Amendment 3, does there need to be some type of legislative relief, something explicit that can direct you to start expunging records? Or can you, within your own power and your own fiefdom, kind of do some type of retroactive or some type of open expungement process now that, essentially the crimes that people have on their records would no longer be crimes, and we know that the Florida legislature has never been a beacon of progressive criminal justice reform. So that's why my question goes to you is, we know that the political will doesn't necessarily exist there to expunge records and clean things up. We saw how they screwed the pooch on Amendment 4. But if we get the right people at the state attorney's level like yourself, will you all have the power to kind of do something to right these wrongs that we've seen for the last 60 years?
Yeah, the short answer is probably not. You probably do need legislative involvement. You need a law to be passed, because I, as the state attorney, can't just simply go out and expunge people's records on my own. There's an application process for the state, and the reality is, if something was illegal yesterday and someone was convicted of that crime for having broken that law, then that's not really a basis for expungement under the current law. So you would need the legislative action. And Chris, you brought up such a good point on this, and about Amendment 4. Amendment 4 being the restoration of returning citizens' voting rights that was passed in 2018, right? The people passed this constitutional amendment and said, we want this. We want our people who are returning to our communities to have a pathway to re-engaging as full citizens. And again, there were limitations. If you're convicted of like murder and rape, you weren't eligible, but for most people you were. And the state of Florida undermined that. They basically cut the legs out from under a constitutional amendment passed by the people. And that's why I talk about the importance of, what is the legislature going to do if Amendment 3 passes? Are they going to turn their backs on what the people clearly want and voted for by 60% margin and saying, well, you guys voted for this and we don't want it and we're not going to do anything to help? Or are they going to do their jobs and follow the lead of what the people voted for, and then start passing legislation that takes us from, now Amendment 3 is, now marijuana is constitutional, but we need a legislative framework and statutory framework and legal framework and regulatory framework to actually make it work in the way that people want it to work. You're going to have to ask your local representative, but I certainly hope that if Amendment 3 passes, they do the right thing rather than, playing politics with this.
Now, Andrew, I want to stick the camera in my face here for a second.
Ouch.
I just want to jump in here and say, unfortunately, I don't think they're going to do a very good job. I mean, if history has anything to say about it, they've done a horrible job of implementing medical marijuana. I can't see Amendment 3 doing well as far as the legislator implementation. However, I think it's pretty important that we still vote yes, just because of all those arrests that we were talking about earlier. I don't know. Do you think it's likely that the legislator will? Is there any way that we can see a turn in Florida politics in any way coming soon?
I'm terrible about predicting these things. So I'll tell you that I continue to have faith in the people who serve in government, that they're there to do what they believe is the right thing to help people. And now we have seen countless counterexamples of that, right? Every time the governor opens his mouth, he's the exception to that rule. But I do hope that Tallahassee, if Amendment 3 passes, does the right thing to try to make this work. There are problems with the medicinal marijuana framework. Hopefully they learn from that and they create a robust framework for recreational marijuana, again, to keep it out of the hands of kids, to limit the potency, to take the necessary steps to make this work, to make, keep Floridians safe, to keep them healthy, and to honor the request that they've made by legalizing this particular, vice.
Well, let's touch on that for a second, right? When we come to where they're at with medicinal marijuana, right? The medical system has its shortcomings, clear shortcomings that it still has. Number one, the amount of qualifying conditions. Gary's actually written a bill that would expand it from 10 to around 33. There are people who have major debilitating conditions that don't have access to it. Autism spectrum disorder is definitely one that should be explicitly on there. We've seen the amazing results in other medicinal states where people who have autism have access, actually have improvements in behavior, in lowering manic episodes, and there's issues of that. And, the right to keep your job as a medical patient is something that the legislature has clearly screwed up on for the last 7 years, in the sense that people are still fired from their jobs despite having a medical card. So, one, we need to change workplace drug testing laws in the state of Florida. Two, we need to end urinalysis as a form of drug testing. You mentioned earlier, Andrew, in a world of total prohibition, smell of marijuana clearly is probable cause, because it shouldn't be anywhere near you to begin with. Same with workplace drug testing. In a world of total prohibition, it shouldn't be in your bloodstream, your urine stream at all. But we live in a world now where that's no longer the case. That's no longer the reality. So, urinalysis is not an indication of impairment. We need to change how we test for workplace impairment as well, not just this outdated, a model from a prohibitionist era. And then we look at, the fact that being a medical patient itself doesn't make you a bad person, a bad employee, or a bad parent. And people can still have their medical status used against them in court, in custody hearings. It can be investigated by CPS. And so these are all the things that we've endeavored over the last 5 years to address through the legislative process, and the Florida legislature hasn't given it the time of day to address any of these issues in a meaningful manner. We had former Republican Party Chairman Joe Gruters on last week, and he made a commitment to at least take a look at these issues and address them. I hope Senator Gruters, that you do work with leadership to actually address these things in a meaningful way, because if we're going to move forward with an adult use system, there are other things to consider, and we touched on them already. Eliminating the smell of marijuana as probable cause. Again, we look at issues of access for kids and such. We need to make sure that the legal market is properly regulated, that they're doing what they need to do. And then, there's this issue of competition in the state in order to address issues of quality and address issues of fairness. There should be other licensed entities other than the vertically integrated market, which has been a major criticism of the amendment. Because many people who say, I don't want to vote for this, that are cannabis advocates, say, it's only going to enrich a certain group of people. And so, being that the amendment does have a small clause in it that will allow the state legislature to license other entities, in particular, these hemp businesses like Carlos's that are doing it the right way, those would be the folks that I would say should get the first crack at retail sales or selling, from other dispensaries and selling other products and such. But also the legislature needs to not tax this back into the black market, because we've seen it in California. When you have high tax rates on adult use cannabis, people are either going to choose not to participate in that market and go somewhere where prices are cheaper. We see that everywhere, in pretty much any capitalist system. People will go to a black market for cheaper prices than go to a regulated market, especially when sometimes the regulated market isn't safer. There are a lot of things that can be sprayed on the cannabis in the state of Florida that should not be sprayed on it. And the Florida Department of Agriculture, right now under Wilton Simpson, seems to be a bit distracted. I haven't seen them address quality control issues with the regulated medical marijuana market, but they're in Carlos's shop every other month.
I wonder why that is.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, look, this is why it's important to have this conversation, because the reality is the successful transition from something that's illegal to something that's legal. You have to get into the weeds of it, no pun intended. I mean, there's a lot of work to do to make this work, for all the things you've touched on, from how does it work with law enforcement? How do you regulate it? How do you keep it safe? Who do you sell it to? Who gets the contracts? How, what does the capitalist structure look like? What's the taxation? There are a lot of issues there. And it's frankly why these types of things work better in a legislative capacity than a constitutional capacity. But in Florida, because the legislature has not moved forward and followed the will of the people on this, now you have a constitutional amendment, which will hopefully set the framework for this. But then you need the legislature to follow through and actually make this work to implement it.
Yeah. Well, Gary, you just touched on too, is that the primaries had such low turnout. And the sad part is primaries is where we elect the right people to be on the ballot in November. You know, Andrew Warren is the right person to be on that ballot in November for a state attorney. You know, but some races are essentially decided in a primary because of the way redistricting or districting is, in the sense that, oh, this is always going to be a Democrat seat, or this will always be a Republican seat. So it's in this primary where there's only, you know, 10 to 20% turnout of voters that actually affect it. And that's the sad part, is that we get some of these outlandish people in office, the type who, you know, thank God for slavery, or the type that, you know, want to whitewash history to get rid of all the bad things, or the type of people who want to ban books. And so this is a major concern that we have. And so, you know, Gary touched on the abysmal turnout for the primary. I'm making a call to everyone who is registered to vote. Please, if you're not registered to vote, now's the time to do it. If you vote by mail, now's the time to renew your vote by mail request. Most people may not know this, but Governor DeSantis passed the law that says you have to essentially re-request every election cycle if you want to vote by mail. So, you know, everything that's being done to suppress the vote, you know, in a legal manner is happening across not just Florida, but in multiple states. And so if you watch this show, regardless of where you are in America, check your voter registration status, get registered to vote, sign up to vote by mail, follow your ballot, track your ballot, and let's make sure we're electing the right people in office to make things happen. Gary, I'm off my soapbox. Please take the mic.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm concerned about the politicalization of the judicial branch. I mean, that's we have here in Florida. All of our judges, you know, when they go out there and they campaign, they can't talk about topics that they're not allowed to, and they are voted in as nonpartisan. So all you can do is go back and take a look at their voting records and talk to them about other things and get a gist of whether or not they should be retained or they should be put on the judicial branch. State attorneys, not so much. There you have a Republican and Democrat, and you therefore have a political fight on our hands. And of course, I am not in favor of state attorneys being appointed, because then you just have a drop down from whoever's in charge on the upper level, the executive branch, and they might just pick people who don't think like the public they're supposed to serve. So I get concerned about, why is it that, you know,
He froze.
was NPA primaries. I was able to vote, and I was able to vote for the judges and things of that sort. But
Gary,
that's what it came down to. Yeah.
Gary, do me a favor and repeat your question. You kind of skipped there.
Ah, boy. Where did I leave off?
Just the last two sentences.
Okay. Yeah, I voted NPA over here in Hernando County, which means I practically had nobody to vote for. I could vote for Niehaus whether I wanted to or not. And there was a county commissioner that I guess was put in there by DeSantis named Ryan something or other, who took out the incumbent. But the fact is, I really had no way to vote for anybody. So I can see how in a lot of cases, the primaries thing goes down. We need to have open primaries for one thing. Because when you're in areas like rural areas like myself, I would like to have a choice between candidates, because I don't vote party, I vote candidate. That's just the way I am, because I believe that's a more appropriate way to handle things. But Andy, I want to get your take on how you think there can be a balance between the politicalization of the process and people getting into office who are fair to all the people.
Well, we have democracy, we have elections. And so, you know, to your point, you don't like the idea of state attorneys being appointed. Neither do Floridians. That's why we have elections for them. That's why people are so outraged at what the governor did to me. And not just Democrats, but, you know, the number of Republicans who have come up to me and have said, this is awful. This is not American. This is not democratic. This is not the way our state is supposed to work. It gives me a lot of faith and confidence when I've had people come up to me and say, you know, I had a man come up to me right after this happened and said, I didn't vote for you the first time and I didn't vote for you the second time, but this is wrong. And you shouldn't have been suspended. If we don't want you in office, we'll handle it at the ballot box. And I totally agree. Now I asked him, I was like, maybe you'll vote for me the third time. But, you know, that's why we have elections, Gary, right? You have to have people come out. You have to have an informed citizenry who understand some of the issues. You know, the parties help simplify that, because it really is hard to do the research on every single race and every single candidate. So just knowing, okay, if this person's a Democrat or Republican or Green Party, they probably align with this core set of views and values. But we need more participation. And we've talked about the fact that In the primary, participation in Hillsborough County was under 20%. Hopefully it's going to be up around that 75 to 80% for the general election. But, people need to exercise their rights to vote. People have literally fought and died for generations to secure the right to vote for Americans, for minorities, for women. And then just to take it for granted and then shrug at what happens when we don't like the people in office is silly. Like, exercise your right, make your voice heard, and elect people who represent your values and your priorities.
Let me ask you, and I may be drawing a connection where there's no connection at all, but why wasn't the court allowed to like reinstate you?
So in short, we sued in federal court.
Yeah.
And the federal court made very clear findings. It ruled that the allegations against me that the governor said were totally false, that the suspension was politically motivated, that the governor broke state and federal law. Those were the three main findings. But the court came to the conclusion that the violations of state law outweighed the violations of federal law, and therefore this should be in state court. We disagreed with that and we appealed, and the appellate court appropriately said, if there's any violation of federal law, it doesn't matter whether it's outweighed by the state law violations. If there's any violation of federal law, then the court has the power to reinstate me. So that appellate court decision came down in January of this year. Unfortunately, the case hasn't moved forward since then. We don't know the reason why. We have asked the court several times, this is the appellate court up in Atlanta, to go ahead and send the case back, called remand, to the court in Tallahassee so that I can be reinstated. But for reasons unbeknownst to any of us, they haven't done so yet. And it's hard to tell whether they're going to do it before the election. But at the end of the day, the most important thing was not about whether I get my job back, because it's not my job. The job belongs to the people. Our fight was about the principles involved. The idea that the governor can't just suspend whoever he wants in a political stunt. And the court's rulings have made clear that that was illegal and that the governor can't do that going forward.
Man, it would just be so freaking sweet if 3 and 4 pass and you get put back into your spot. Like it just would seem like the best thing can happen for our. I don't know. I just imagine DeSantis just being like so pissed.
Carlos, the only way that dream works for me is if Rick Scott is also no longer our senator on November 6th, in addition to 3, 4, and Andrew Warren being our state attorney. That would be a great way to wake up on Wednesday morning.
I just imagine him just like walking around the governor's mansion, just like, God damn it, just like kicking things with his feet.
Again, we have a situation with the Republican Party in Florida, who constantly believes like for instance, the Attorney General is actually the attorney for the governor. And that's not the case. Ashley Moody is not Ron DeSantis' client, and Blondie, whoever was before him, was not Rick Scott's attorney, but they acted that way. They did not act in independence like they're supposed to in order to make certain of the consistency of jurisprudence. Obviously, Andrew, as state attorney, you always have to work within the four corners of the law, and you have your discretion in between that area. You can't go beyond that and say, well, yeah, I'm going to do this just because the governor wants me to do it, not because there's any particular legal or law. So this leads me to another question in regards to Amendment 3. One thing they do not really cover that well in that 75-word introduction for the summary, and even within the other documents ahead of that, is what about public use? They really have been pushing to say we should vote yes on Amendment 3 because it'll reduce the number of arrests. However, if public use is still 100% illegal, and there's a difference between possession and use. Yes, if you catch you with 2.5 ounces that you haven't used right now, they will no longer be illegal. But if you have a joint in your hand, no matter where you are, you will be arrested. It's not a matter of how much you have; it's a matter of if you're using it at all. And so, do you see that Amendment 3 will reduce the number of arrests because of the fact that there's still no real clarification in regards to public use? And by the way, I do believe that Mar-a-Lago is officially a private club, so you actually can smoke in the club. And I'm going to ask Jason Beck if he sees Wink Martindale, doing the thing every once in a while in the corner. But what do you see in regards to how this clarifies in regards to public use?
It doesn't clarify public use. And this goes back to a point I made before, that these types of laws are often just better implemented through the legislative process than the constitutional amendment, because so many questions get left unanswered with a constitutional amendment that isn't designed to address every single nuance of the issue. Public use is a really important issue on this. I mean, as a society, if we decide that there should be recreational marijuana, do we want it like tobacco, where you can walk down the street and smoke a cigarette, or like alcohol, where you can't walk down the street and drink a beer? I mean, we have two other vices, right, that we regulate in a very different way when it comes to public use. So what are we going to do about marijuana? This is why, at the risk of, repeating myself, you need the legislature to come in, and you need to have the compromise that happens in the legislative process. You need to have those discussions and the public debate, and where do people come out on this? Personally, I don't like the idea of having public use on it. I've been to cities where they have it. It turns me off a little bit as to walk down the streets and when you can smell marijuana. I don't want my kids exposed to that. If as a society we say we want that in Florida, then okay, that's the way the democratic and the legislative process should work. But we have to figure those things out for this to work successfully, which is why, again, my point is this is a long-term process to get this right. It's not just November, people pass Amendment 3 and all of a sudden everything is copacetic with this. It simply doesn't work that way.
Well, Gary, you bring up a good point about public use. I recall being in Colorado in the spring of 2017, and I was at, it's 420. I'm watching, the Whalers on stage right in downtown Denver, and the cops are walking through the crowd and giving people $1,000 citations for public use. So, even in, what some people may consider the mecca of legalization, you see that public use still remains an issue. Obviously, they weren't arresting people, but $1,000 ticket is one hell of a deterrent to smoking publicly. And I think, Andrew, you have the right approach when it comes to public safety. I mean, if instead of arresting people, which Gary's concern is for public use, obviously a civil citation, people don't like getting tickets, and so that will discourage things. Some of my more anti-capitalist minded friends will say a ticket is only for poor people, because if you're rich enough, you have the privilege to not have to worry about it. You can pay it. But all in all, that's not a bad approach to things. I mean, obviously, me and Carlos are probably more of the opinion we should do this like New York. If you can smoke a cigarette, what's the point of that? Not being able to smoke your weed. And it opens up a lot of questions. You bring it up, like at Gasparilla time, we lowered the threshold for public alcohol consumption along Bayshore. Will you be able to smoke weed at Gasparilla because you can have a beer? Why can't you have a joint? So these are things that do need to be debated, whether it's at the city council level or the state legislature. Obviously is going to have some say so. And in Florida, what we don't have is really a laboratory of democracy, because the state legislature preempts every single thing that the local governments try to do. If a local government wants to say, hey, workers shouldn't be out in the heat, they should get a 15-minute break and they should be paid a certain minimum wage. And then you have the Florida legislature come in and say, no, you got to do what we say. And so that's the biggest issue that we have. And that's why elections are so important. You have a lot of people, in the chat right now saying, well, this isn't about public safety. It's about a money grab. And they're not necessarily wrong, in the sense that the Florida legislature has chosen winners and losers since the outset of our medical marijuana system, and it goes back to, the Bashirs and them really trying to set up a system where they were going to make money, and they use Trulieve as their economic engine to do so. And then you see, now in Florida, we don't have any homegrown, essentially, Florida companies. Everything is run by a multi-state operator. I think VitaCan was the last one, and they sold out to a multi-state operator. Am I right, Gary? Everybody's now essentially operating in multiple states. Trulieve is the only homegrown Florida company, and they're operating. They're the largest probably in the country, if anything, as far as market share.
Yeah, I was a big fan of Trulieve at the very beginning, but their corporate culture seemed to be more pro-profit and less pro-patient, and that really concerned me, and that continues on in the various states that they work at. And I'm more concerned about what people do as opposed to what they just say. And that's basically where it comes from between me and Truly, but we guys can talk. Andrew, I want to ask you a quick question. How often do legislators come to you as a state attorney and ask you your opinion on how laws should be written so they're more implementable in the real world?
It happens all the time, actually. So, and this is one of the ironies of my suspension, one of the many. State attorneys are frequently invited to come up to Tallahassee to testify on legislation that's being proposed and the impacts of it, whether they support it or not support it. So when I was suspended for criticizing the abortion bans that were happening, and there were some people who said, well, Andrew, you kind of should have, kept your opinion to yourself. One, first of all, that's not how the First Amendment works. Like, I have not only the same rights as everybody else, but the Supreme Court has made clear that the First Amendment is at its pinnacle when you have elected officials opining on these issues of public importance. But secondly, to your point, we get asked. So imagine they invite people up and they say, State Attorney John, State Attorney Sally, how do you feel about this proposed legislation? And someone says, I like it. The next person says, I don't like it. And then they suspend that person for saying they said they didn't like it. I mean, that's how crazy this is. So yeah, this is typical. I hope the legislature does its job, as I've said, and actually engages with law enforcement and prosecutors and community groups to figure out some of these issues, because there are no clear answers for how to do this the best way. Chris raised an incredibly important point about local control. Do you want different counties to be able to say, well, we're okay with people smoking outside, we are not okay with people smoking? That local control is another important element of all of this that needs to be figured out. So, again, I think the theme for this morning has been, we need the legislature to do its job and work with the people to figure out the best way to implement this if it passes.
I got a good laugh when I was leaving Florida, and I saw the big sign at the border saying, "Welcome to the free state of Florida," and Ron DeSantis. I don't think he actually means that, per se. I don't see that they're operating under that kind of principle, but I guarantee you that if Amendment 3 passes, and there's a possibility we can get past 60%, we'll see how things go on. I am going to have to work on something in regards to public use that is workable, and I'd like to get a chance to talk with you and other state attorneys as what is the best path forward. I think that's the right way to handle things.
And Gary, Andrew mentioned something too about potency caps. In the sense that the amount of milligrams per dose. That I'm okay with, having some type of limitation, because some people don't know their limits, especially when it comes to edibles. So if you're going to limit things to, 10 milligrams per edible makes sense to me. What I do have a concern about is limiting the amount of cannabinoid content in the medicine that people need. Because again, the adult use market is still going to be used medicinally for some people who don't want to be on a registry or who don't have the money to go out of pocket and pay for a $300 doctor recommendation. And so, that goes to other concerns too around potency caps and that sort of thing. I mean, and we can go back and forth science-wise as to, does high THC cause any type of medical issues? And, there are scientists on both sides of this, but the vast majority of them, will show that, people don't go crazy because they have high THC content. They just sit down on the couch. But I do think that Andrew brings up a good point as to, safety. We have these issues of packaging and such. Carlos can tell you that the legislature, the Department of Ag, have issues with what type of packaging he can put, or whether or not a gummy can be in the shape of a star, because they consider that marketing to kids. So there's a lot of other things to consider. And this legislative session is going to go really fast. As soon as November is over and the elections are decided, we're looking at the end of January, and committee weeks are already be starting to rev up. So we pretty much have, and then we have legislative delegations to attend. So, the real work for this legislative session in Amendment 3, and I'm saying this to all of you listeners out there, is going to come as soon as the November elections are over. From November to the end of December is where we're going to have to put in the vast majority of our efforts, because by the time February, March rolls around in legislative session, everything's already going to be decided. So we need you, the people, to go ahead and become a member today. You can go ahead and scan that QR code right there, join Suncoast Normal, be a part of the fight. We need your time, we need your treasure, we need your talent. talent, and we need you to be engaged in the political process. You can go to suncoastnormal.org and become a member. If you want to see home grow in the state of Florida, we need you so we can push this through the legislative process. If you want to see, how you're able to actually utilize your medicine in public, or whether or not you can still keep your job, we're going to need you. We're going to need your support. If you're a parent out there, if you're a professional, you want to keep your kids, you want to keep your professional licenses. These are issues that the Florida legislature is going to need to hear from you, and we're going to need to have our members engaged in this process. And so I want to say thank you again to Andrew for coming on the show today. Gary, thank you for always lining up amazing guests like Andrew Warren. And again, for those of you out there, get out and go vote this November. Who is in office matters. Who is in these various positions in our judiciary matter. And having Andrew Warren as our state attorney, the evidence is there. He's been an amazing state attorney up until the time that the governor chose to remove him from office for political reasons, and we need him back in office. And Andrew, as far as support goes, yes, I want you as state attorney, but I love to see you as our attorney general in 2026.
Yeah. Do you have any plans to go higher up in office?
Well, let's get this man in the office first, Carlos. One thing about candidates, it's always insulting to ask about the next office when they got to win the one that's on the ballot, brother.
Is that insulting? Because I'm saying I could see Andrew as like governor or senator or something like that. I don't know.
None of that's insulting. It's always encouraging when people want you to do more. And look, any way that I can help the state of Florida, I'm open to. But to Chris's point, my goal right now is to get back in the state attorney's office, to reverse the increase in crime we've seen over the past 2 years, to make sure that the voters get to decide who serves, to keep fighting for the changes that we made that made Hillsborough County safer and our system more fair and more effective.
And Andrew, do me a favor, look in that camera like you are right now and tell people how they can find you and support you.
You can find my website and support me at andrewwarrenfl.com. That's Andrew, ANDREW, WARRENFL.com. And you can follow me at all social media at Andrew Warren FL. Thank you so much again for having me. I'll see you online at Andrew Warren FL.
Do you have news to do, Kano?
Yeah, let's roll out the news and then we'll wrap up the show.
Oh, hold on a second. I got one more quick question. I apologize for running over, but my mind just is in every direction at once. But I wanted to talk just briefly about home grow because people have been asking a lot of questions in regards to it. And they're saying it's all about money and power and things of that sort. It's also a matter of what we need to do is make certain if we do have a home grow that they don't go crazy in Tallahassee by saying we're creating an unenforceable bill. Do you see that as an issue, Andrew?
I do. Again, the law, the constitutional amendment is pretty broad. It basically says that it expands medicinal marijuana to recreational under the age of 21. And as Chris pointed out, and this is critical, it says nothing in this amendment prohibits the legislature from enacting laws consistent with this amendment. And so it really leaves the door wide open for the legislature to walk through and figure out issues from local rule, potency, public use, homegrown, et cetera, how the market is going to work. So that's another one of those issues that will need to be addressed.
Yep.
And on that note, it's time for the news.
All right. So let's first off kick off coming out of Washington, D.C., latest news. The American Council of Independent Laboratories has provided commercially available analysis of commercially available products. Hemp-derived intoxicating products typically contain greater quantities of THC than are actually allowable under federal law, and some products also contain elevated levels of pesticides, according to the ACIL. Now, researchers published commercially available hemp-derived products, flower, pre-roll, vape pens from either retail or online stores in 6 states: Arizona, California, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York. Labs performed analytical testing of the products for purity and potency and compared their results with the product certificate of authenticity, their COAs. Now, consistent with other studies, most products contain quantities of cannabinoids that were inconsistent with the product's COA. In most cases, products contain far less Delta-8 THC than advertised and higher levels of THC than permissible under the 2018 federal Farm Act. 7 of the 48 products tested, 15%, also contain pesticides at levels higher than those permitted under state law. Consumers are unwittingly consuming contaminated products, researchers have reported. The study's authors concluded the clear takeaway from the study is that the current landscape of intoxicating hemp product testing does not accurately reflect the legality of the products being sold by vendors nationwide. It also illustrates the need for legislators to provide a robust regulatory framework for the testing of hemp products that ensure honest and accurate reporting of intoxicants and contaminants by testing laboratories. Why am I starting out with this? Well, this has been a big issue in the news here in Florida with Ron DeSantis looking to have hemp businesses going against, Amendment 3 and trying to shut down this effort for adult use in the medical marijuana industry. And so, I want to be clear is that Ron DeSantis, the legislature, Wilton Simpson, the Department of Agriculture can spend more time focused on laboratory testing for both the hemp industry and the medical marijuana industry, rather than a lot of these enforcement issues that we're seeing and them cracking down on a lot of hemp businesses. Is let's focus on the safety and efficacy of these products for the public, rather than the sensationalism that we saw in the Florida legislature last session and crying about what about the children, what about the sick people who are accessing these products. And so let's make sure that those certificates of authenticity are really authentic. So moving on. Coming out of Oslo, Norway, according to data published in the Forensic Science International Journal, analysis show that THC blood concentrations are not correlated with impairment. This is something that we touched on earlier in the show when we were talking about urinalysis testing. But Norwegian researchers have assessed the relationship between drug concentrations and impaired psychomotor performance in a cohort of over 15,000 individuals suspected of drug driving and over 3,600 drug-free controls. Driving performance was assessed by the participants' performance on a clinical test of impairment, a CTI, and consistent with prior literature, the correlation between drug concentration for high ethanol but low for THC. Specifically, authors determined that for THC, the median drug concentrations changed little between drivers assessed as not impaired and impaired. They concluded that the lack of a close relationship between drug concentration of THC and the degree of impairment at the individual level is in accordance with several observations from experimental studies where participants engaged in the controlled intake of cannabis. The authors' findings are consistent with those of numerous studies reporting that neither the detection of THC nor its metabolites in blood or other bodily fluids is predictive of impaired driving performance. As a result, NORML has long opposed the imposition of per se THC limits for motorists and has alternatively called for the expanded use of mobile performance technology like Druid, which can give you a simple 15 to 30 second impairment test on an iPad. And that's where we see law enforcement needing to take these issues in regards to drug driving and some of these issues that we touched on today, moving post Amendment 3 should it pass. Now, let's talk about polls. According to the latest Gallup poll, Americans say alcohol and tobacco are more harmful than cannabis. Coming out of D.C., national polling data provided by Gallup show that a greater percentage of Americans believe that alcohol and nicotine pose greater dangers to health than marijuana. 79% of respondents acknowledged that cigarettes are very harmful to health. 1/3 of respondents said alcohol was very harmful. By contrast, 26% of those surveyed said cannabis was very harmful. 22% said it was not harmful at all. The survey results are consistent with those of prior polls, finding that most Americans perceive marijuana to be less harmful than alcohol or cigarettes. Now, let's just, as we start to wrap up here, we're looking at a study coming out of the Journal for Nurse Practitioners, which show that medical cannabis patients report an improved quality of life and reduced prescription drug use. Patients authorized to consume state legal medicinal cannabis products report improvements in their health-related quality of life and less reliance on their prescription medications, according to this data in the Journal for Nurse Practitioners. Researchers affiliated with Old Dominion University in Virginia surveyed 31 patients enrolled in the state's medical cannabis program. All participants resided in rural Virginia. And consistent with other studies, the researchers reported that patients' health and well-being improved significantly after medicinal cannabis was added to their treatment regimen, and prescription medication use decreased significantly. The quality of life and symptom intensity improved significantly. The study's authors concluded medical cannabis should be considered an alternative treatment for patients who suffer from anxiety, depression, insomnia, or chronic pain. The longitudinal data published last year in the Journal of Cannabis and Cannabinoid Research reported that patients experience sustained improvements in pain, anxiety, and mood following the use of medical cannabis. And according to a 2023 study published in the Journal of American Medical Association, nearly 1 in 4 pain patients residing in states where medical cannabis access is legal self-identify as marijuana consumers. Now, looking at West Virginia, Charleston, West Virginia adopts a citizen-initiated measure depenalizing marijuana possession. Charleston, West Virginia has a population of around 47,000 people, and their city council amended and approved a citizen-initiated municipal measure that significantly reduces local penalties for low-level marijuana possession offenses. Local activists gathered over 4,000 signatures in favor of the proposed measure, and council members had the option of voting on the measure or placing it on the November ballot. As amended and approved, Bill number 8039 removes fines and the threat of jail time for first-time low-level possession of 15 grams or less. West Virginia law classifies marijuana possession as a criminal misdemeanor punishable by up to 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine. Those with prior convictions face fines between $250 and $500, and following the payment and or completion of other terms set by the court, eligible defendants will have their convictions dismissed. Others may file to have their convictions expunged within 6 months. Again, would we see something like this in Florida? With the preemption that the Florida legislature tends to have on local governments, probably going to end up following in line with state law. And lastly, as we conclude the news, clinical trial data published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology showed that plant-derived cannabis extracts are safe and effective for treating refractory nausea. And Australian investigators assess the use of standardized cannabis extracts versus placebo in 147 patients undergoing intravenous chemotherapy. Australian law actually permits physicians to prescribe cannabis products to patients unresponsive to conventional treatments. And participants in the study all suffered from nausea and vomiting despite taking standard antiemetic medications. The patients consumed either extracts or placebo 3 times a day, in addition to their prescription medications. And compared to placebo, the cannabis extracts significantly reduced the vomiting frequency and improved patients' quality of life. Research concluded that an oral formulation of THC to CBD was an effective adjunct to the standard antiemetic for prevention and treatment of refractory, chemo-induced nausea and vomiting. So, essentially an oral application of a 1-to-1 THC to CBD seems to be effective and safe for the prevention of nausea. So that's the normal news. That's what we got this weekend. We really appreciate everyone listening out there. And for those of you that are home grow advocates, again, this is our window with the implementation of Amendment 3 and this upcoming legislative session. Gary has an amazing home grow bill that we're continuing to push. We know that with a Republican legislature, you heard it from this former state attorney in Hillsborough County as well today, there are concerns over around home grow, and Gary has written a bill that we feel as though will still allow us the right to grow it ourselves and for the state to properly have enough regulation to prevent things from getting out of hand. And so we need you to join us this legislative session. Pay attention to our voter guide that we have coming out for the November elections, which we'll be releasing shortly here in September. And again, shout out to all the amazing candidates who won their primaries, especially those that were, of course, normal endorsed candidates. And we're going to have more of our primary election winners like Andrew Warren coming on the show in the coming weeks and telling you why they should be elected on the November ballot coming up. With that, I'll pass the mic to you, Gary, to close us out.
Okay. Yeah, we do have an excellent home grow bill. And yeah, they could not put it on Amendment 3. But as we're trying to bring out in the conversation we have today, without Amendment 3 passing, it'll be much harder to get the home grow thing moving forward, because this gives us an opportunity, a window to be able to mold the program to the way we like it. I'm sure everybody who is libertarian out there wants to say, I want to be able to just grow it in my backyard. Well, that would be fine if you lived on the moon and it was only you by yourself. But the problem is, we not only deal with our neighbors, but we also deal with bad neighbors who do things like this guy is over at the cannabis and make it harder for everybody by breaking the law so flagrantly that it makes it harder for you who want your freedoms and your liberties to be able to go forward. So we're trying to equate that balance that allows you to have the freedom that you want and keeps the people in Tallahassee from wetting their pants on a regular basis. One of the things with home grow is they're always worried about diversion of product. They're always worried that if somebody grows in their backyard, the kids coming home from school are going to take their samples on the way home. Obviously, a person who grows it for their own medicine is not going to be allowing the kids in the neighborhood to go ahead and take their medicine away from them any more than they would have their medicine cabinet sitting on the porch along with the take a book, make a book kind of thing. It's not going to happen. So let's work together, and we can make this happen. We'll get the home grow done right. We'll get the public use done right. But we need your help and we need your input, for God's sakes. We're going to probably have maybe a town hall or two on the way before we finish this election. But in the meantime, and this goes out to all the representatives out there and all the candidates out there, if you have not filled out your survey we sent to you, it's your fault that you didn't get a chance to get endorsed by the people who listed on the rotation. Get your survey done, send it in. If we approve, we'll have you on the show so you can talk to a wider audience, get the visibility you need, and get your platform out there. In the meantime, for those people who didn't win, especially Therese, God bless. We know what happens
when she didn't win. That sucks, dude.
Yeah, man. She was running against that incumbent who, thank God for slavery. So
yeah,
that's a rough one. That's a rough one.
There's one person that they all needed to win, but I really wanted her to win.
But
Yeah.
Ashley Brundage did win, along with helping Carlos fix his system, I think.
Yeah, hey, shout out to Ashley. Ashley, winning their primary, and then we'll see how things shake up in the general election. But Ashley definitely making history in their race, and of course, thanks for the tips on the restream too. our restream has gotten a little bit better since Ashley gave us some tips.
Really helped us out. They got this new little thing there too.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
And Debbie Merkisel Powell, boy, you blew the primary away. Let's make certain that Rick Scott doesn't get back in office. We had enough. I think I've personally had enough of Earthworm Rick.
Oh man, look, I can tell you every time we have a normal action alert and I click in, I send the email and it goes to Rick Scott, Marco Rubio, I get so irritated with the responses because they're just holding the line as prohibitionist. And it makes no sense that in a state like Florida, where we have medicinal marijuana, where we're looking, we have the polling numbers for adult use, people want to grow at home. You have two prohibitionist senators representing this state. And this is our opportunity this November to get rid of one of our prohibitionist senators, one who was not a very good governor. And we can definitely have the opportunity to correct this wrong and make sure Rick Scott does not see another 6 years in office by voting for Debbie Merkisel Powell, who has also been brave enough to come on the rotation. And so that says a lot about where she is on this policy and who we need as our senator come this November.
I think he's also willing to make it a law in the state of Florida to not put salami into Cuban sandwiches. So that's good.
Yeah, that would be a good thing. There'd be a lot of pissed off people here in Tampa, though. No,
if you Miami Cubans start fucking with our Tampa Cuban, we're gonna have problems, Carlos.
I actually got something I want to run by you guys. Like, there's all right. So check this out. I have a feeling that like a couple words have changed their meanings lately, right? Mm-hmm. There's the word addiction and the word overdose, right? And the word overdose, it used to mean like somebody died from taking too many drugs and whatnot. And now it means you're uncomfortable from taking too. But the word addiction, I really want to talk to you guys about. And like, it seemed like Half Baked at one point set the record straight when it came to addiction in cannabis, right? Mm-hmm. There was that famous scene where Bob Saget got up and said, "I used to suck dick for coke," right? Have you ever sucked dick for marijuana? And then Dave Chappelle's like, no, can't say that I have. And I said, boo this man, and we get him out of the freaking thing, right?
I felt that way when I had to go to court order rehab in 2014, Carlos. Trust me, I know.
So you have interacted with people that have had addiction problems, and as you guys are familiar, I've had a business partner that had addiction problems, and I had a young lady that was important to me died from an overdose. But there was this gentleman that I was arguing with the other day, and he was like, "You can definitely get addicted to marijuana," and like he was citing things that like people need to smoke marijuana to do their laundry. Or smoke marijuana, like they don't want to go to a kick-ass show because they don't allow marijuana smoke. What do you guys think about that? Like, is that like an addiction?
That's a habituation. That's a big difference. One is a behavioral attitude. One is a actual chemical reaction in the brain that has a lot to do with endorphins and things of that sort that your body craves. Like, for instance, the addiction you used to have with tobacco. Nicotine increases the number of sensories in the brain that require nicotine. So the more you smoke, the more you need to smoke, that kind of situation. And that's what creates an addiction. Not the same thing at all as saying, I really am not as creative without having at least some sativa in me. That's a bit of a difference. That's
Well,
not addiction.
what about people that, like, you know, I'm not going to go to that place if they don't allow marijuana smoke.
It's no different than people who say I'm not going to go there because they don't serve alcohol. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
think about when the TPD tried to shut down Jokes and Tokes, right? Because we were going to have a mini bar, right? How many people decided not to come to the show because they couldn't drink? You know, so again, I'm glad we got Gary as our resident master of public health, you know, to answer these things. But you got a great point, Carlos. You know, in the words of Inigo Montoya, this word that you think doesn't mean what you think it thinks, you know.
No, but okay, so what comes to my mind though is, like, say somebody suffers from crippling social anxiety and they need to take some sort of anxiety medicine in order to go to a public place. Like, that's what comes to my mind. I think of it as a medicine, you know.
That is correct. You are absolutely correct. That is not medicine. That is not addiction. That is medicine. That's people who are medicating so they can feel normal. That's what that is the goal of psychotherapy. When it comes to medicine is concerned, not to go crazy, but to feel normal so you can act normally. That is the issue, and that is why I'm concerned about the fact that they actually made it illegal for cannabis use in opioid rehab situation. That is totally contraindicated by all this research that I'm certain that Kano has seen, where it verifies the fact that opioid poisoning can be remediated and cured using a proper regimen of cannabis.
Well, you know, and that goes back to what Carla was saying about the use of the word overdose. You know, in my mind, when I hear the word overdose, I think of someone having to stab you in the heart like Pulp Fiction. You know, not that you got so high that you decided to throw up and someone rushed you to the ER unnecessarily, you know?
It's like he's overdosing on marijuana. Get him an Arizona iced tea and a bag of fucking stat.
You know,
Like,
and let them sleep
the Funyuns help, especially the ones with the pepper on them.
Well, you know, I had an older gentleman call us just this week, and I try to do my best to help him out. He has a new pain management doctor because he recently, you know, switched his insurance. And his new pain management doctor told him, "Oh no, you can't take these opioids that I'm giving you with your marijuana because you can overdose." And I had to explain to him, I'm like, "Sir, you can't overdose on marijuana. I'm not a medical professional, but I could show you all the research that says, you know, otherwise. And, you know, your endocannabinoid system, no matter how stimulated, will never stop breathing, regardless of how much THC you consume. It's a lot different when you're consuming, you know, opioids, which are respiratory suppressants.
Your brain stem, which we will call the reptile brain, is what's in charge of the emotions. That's not affected by cannabis. Other drugs do affect it, and that's the difference.
When did the word overdose become uncomfortable? Like, when did a panic attack qualify as an overdose? Like, there was a shift in the way that we viewed marijuana recently, and I'm on my soapbox, but
no, I think you have a point, Carlos, in that we also have a segment in this society that was once in the fringes that has now gone mainstream. And in that segment of the more conservative elements of our society tend to lean more Christian, and they have this fundamentalist view of sobriety. You know, look, even our Speaker of the House, he's a Mormon, right, Gary? So no caffeine, no coffee for him. I mean, you know, so you have these what once fringe elements of American society are now mainstream and in power, and they push their view of what sobriety is, which is no intoxicants whatsoever in your bloodstream. And I can tell you is that, you know, to quote little Nicky, "Ma'am, I know your son, and when at least he was smoking hashish, he made me laugh occasionally," you know.
All right, that was a pretty good show, guys. That was a lot of fun. Sitting next
Yeah.
to Andrew Warren was pretty dope.
Carlos, you're a braver man than me. I could not sit next to a prosecutor and not sweat, especially after the amount of RSO that I know you did before him coming on the show.
It was like they were doing dabs in the back while he was here.
Well, we got great guests coming
can't
up.
do nothing right now, right? Like he can't really do anything.
It's legal though. Like your shop is legal. It's like, okay, well, it's a Delta 8 dab. What can you do? You know?
What was that, Gary?
We have some great candidates coming up on the show. Our list is not complete yet, so if you're a candidate and if you are in favor of the things we've been talking about, or if you have an opinion you want to express, we will be respectful for that opinion as well. We want you to come on and talk to us and talk to the public, because those are the ones who will be voting for you.
And
Fill out the candidate questionnaire. Yep.
I wanted to share with you, Gary. We can bring the whole "Better Know Your Candidate" segment back, because check this out. I got a surprise for you.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Yeah, if you're a candidate, literally come on the rotation and get in the hot box, if you will. We'll put you in the hot seat, ask you all the questions that folks want to know at home. And for those of you at home watching, listening, hit the like, hit the subscribe button. You can listen to past episodes, of course, on Spotify. You can download us on iTunes, Amazon. Sign up for our email list so you can get notifications each and every week of who's coming on and what's happening. Go to suncoastnormal.org. Of course, become a member and follow us on our various social media channels at Suncoast Normal.